Greetings of peace to you all. Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Aisha El-Amin, and on behalf of Masjid Al-Taqwa, the resident Imam Tariq El-Amin, and the Talim Committee, which is myself, Dr. Gloria Bashir, Dr. Lionel Allen, and Sister Rashida Fitzpatrick, we welcome you to Masjid Al-Taqwa's Talim. This Talim, as well as khutbahs and previous Talims and khutbahs, can be found on Masjid Al-Taqwa's YouTube channel. And so if you have not subscribed, we encourage you to please subscribe and share the link with a few friends. Today we have a very exciting topic and an exciting guest. So we thank you for joining us. Today's topic is Muslim African kingdoms. And I know I had some conversations with other folks around this in anticipation of it. And we are blessed to have our dear Imam Muttaqi Islmail join us. Imam Ismail was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and raised in Brooklyn, New York. His love for history was inspired at an early age by his mother, a history teacher in the New York City Board of Education. When Muttaqi was 15 years old, he traveled to Senegal, West Africa, where he studied Quran and Arabic for 3 years. He then attended Darul Uloom Trinidad and Tobago, where he graduated with a diploma in Islamic studies. In 2015, he began the Islamic History podcast, where he shares his love of Islamic history. If you have not subscribed already to his podcast and listened to it, we do encourage you to do so, please. And so today, our dear brother lives in the Atlanta area with his wife and 5 children, and he works in the tech industry. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to our dear brother, Muttaqi Ismail, for his presentation today.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Aisha, and thank you, Imam Tariq, for inviting me to this. Can everyone hear me okay? I want to make sure we're all okay. Any problems, let me know. All right. I'm going to assume everything is okay, and we'll get going, inshallah. So I don't have to introduce myself. Alhamdulillah, Dr. Aisha has already done that. As she mentioned, I'm raised in Brooklyn, so I tend to talk fast. So if I lose myself, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me. I want this to be as interactive as possible. Do not be ashamed or shy to interrupt me if I go too fast or if you want me to expound on a certain topic. This topic of the African Muslim empires, I'm going to try to focus really on the West African Muslim empires, because there are empires all over Africa that were Muslim. But I'm going to try to concise it to just the West African ones, because that really connects to us as Muslims of African descent in the United States. And so I hope to make that connection if we have enough time. I'm going to further niche down or further specialize this topic into 3 particular empires: the Empire of Ghana, the Empire of Mali, and the Empire of Songhai. There are many more than that. There was, of course, the empire or the kingdom founded by Usman Dan Fodio in what is now Nigeria. There's a Hausa Empire. There's also empires in East Africa. But I'm going to try, and there's also many smaller kingdoms in Senegal and Mauritania and other places, but I'm going to just focus on those 3 major ones, because I'm really trying to make that connection between those empires and us here in the United States. So without further introduction or any further delay, let me go ahead and get right into it. First, the first empire I want to talk about is the Empire of Ghana. You can see, if you can see my screen right now, that yellow area was where the Empire of Ghana existed back in the early medieval era. That's roughly around 700 CE. So 700 CE is roughly about 70 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So with that, obviously, this empire did not begin as a Muslim empire. You can also see that the actual nation of Ghana is a little bit further down. So the nation of Ghana, the modern nation state of Ghana, has absolutely nothing to do with the original empire of Ghana. Just that when Ghana became independent, it chose to adopt that name from the empire of Ghana, but they were hundreds of miles apart, as you can see. Ghana actually was not the name of this empire. It was actually called Wagadu, W-A-G-A-D-U. It's actually called Wagadu. The word Ghana was actually the title of the kings or the emperors of this empire. It began roughly, like I said, around 700 CE. So they were not originally Muslim. Islam came to the empire of Ghana or the empire of Ouagadougou through Arab and Berber merchants. You hear the story, or many people put forth the idea that Islam was spread by the sword. That wasn't entirely true. Ghana became Muslim through a slow process of osmosis. So you would have Berber and Arab traders come down from North Africa, Mauritania, Algeria, Morocco, places like that, come across the Sahara and trade with the Africans of the Ghana Empire. And some decided not to go back. They stayed in Ghana, married local women there, started having children, and just blended into the society and spread Islam either through just discussion or through marriage and just having more children. As simple as that. The thing about the Muslims, however, in the Empire of Ghana, for many centuries, the king of Ghana, the emperor of the Empire of Ghana, maintained what's typically considered traditional African religions, the religions that Africans practiced. There are many of them before the advent of Christianity and Islam, and to a lesser extent, Judaism as well. But because Muslims, the African Muslims, knew how to read Arabic, that allowed them to become valuable members of the administration of that empire. And so the Muslim community, as it continued to grow, it was kind of separate from the regular community within the Ghana Empire, but the Muslims kind of sort of had they had their own section because they were usually officials within the king's administration, within the emperor's administration, and they were able to do this because they knew how to write. Being able to write Arabic will allow them to communicate with other parts of the Muslim world. And so that was a very valuable commodity, very valuable tool for the king of that empire. And so you had these Muslims gaining a lot of authority and power and clout within the Ghana Empire. Another important aspect about the Muslims within the Ghana Empire, and remember, for many years they were still a minority, but they were a respected minority because they were part of the government. They had a lot of control. Another important thing about them is that the Muslims of Ghana tended to dominate trade. I want to make it clear that even though they may have begun, or the initial introduction of Islam may have started off with as Arabs and Berbers, over time, the religion spread. They married, like I said, they married local African women and their children, and they spread Islam throughout through conversion, hopefully through their mannerisms as well. So over time, the physical features would have been just the same as anybody else within the Ghana Empire. So I don't want you to think that it was a subsection of lighter skinned people living somewhere. It wasn't the case. They pretty much all look the same to our eyes, at least, if we could see them. Be that as it may, another interesting aspect about the Muslims within the Empire of Ghana is they tended to dominate trade within the empire. Ghana initially made most of its money through gold. It mined gold and it shipped that gold to other parts of the world, mostly across the Sahara into North Africa, and from there into Europe and points beyond. But because the Muslims operated by a specific code of laws and code of ethics, and they had certain rules, it was much easier for people to deal with the Muslim entrepreneurs and Muslim traders. The non-Muslim African traders, there were, of course, many non-Muslim merchants in Ghana. It was a predominantly non-Muslim society for many centuries. They didn't have the rules that we have as Muslims, so they could just change things and do whatever they wanted, basically, because they didn't have a strict code of rules. And so the people who they were interacting with never knew what to expect. But with the Muslims, they had the rules, they had the laws, and so whether people necessarily agreed with them or not, they at least knew what to expect, made it more stable, and allowed the Muslims to dominate trade in Ghana. Over the years, over the centuries, however, the Muslims of the Empire of Ghana were no longer just a special class. It began to eventually spread beyond just a special class of people, beyond just the government officials, into the mainstream of people. And basically by around 1076 or so, Ghana was predominantly Muslim. The Empire of Ghana was predominantly Muslim. To try to put that into perspective, the Crusades began in 1099. So in 1076, Ghana was a predominantly Muslim empire, and the First Crusade began roughly 25 years after that, 23 years after that. I shouldn't do math live, but roughly 23 years after that. And that was, so you can get an idea of when Ghana became a predominantly Muslim nation. Now, when the Muslims took over, I won't say took over, when the king became Muslim, that's really what happened. When the Muslim population became more numerous within the Empire of Ghana, Ghana also became more militaristic. I don't know if that's just a coincidence or if the Muslims were just anxious to spread the faith, but whatever the case may be, as the Muslims took over or gained more power in Ghana, Ghana became more militaristic and began to spread more. With this spread became the advent of slavery. Slavery already existed in Ghana, definitely, but as they conquered more places around them, that initially led to more captives, and captives, if they weren't executed back in this time, were generally kept as slaves. And so this began a very small and minor slave economy within Ghana. Now I know us as American Muslims, our perception of slavery is very negative. And generally speaking, slavery is negative. There's nothing very positive about slavery whatsoever. But I want to make it clear that for the people back then, Muslim and otherwise, slavery was actually considered a mercy because the alternative was death. If you were captured by your enemy in war, they could either kill you, ransom you, or enslave you. And if the person did not have the money to be ransomed, then the options were death or slavery. And so slavery was considered a mercy. I will talk more about slavery later on because it does play an important part as you get to the other empires. But I just want to let you know that as Ghana began to spread, they added a second stream of income beyond just gold. They also began to invest in slavery as a trade as well. I'll get more into that, but Ghana was not very much into it was not a major slaving industry, but it was part of the economy. Eventually, however, Ghana fell. It was weakened by the Almoravids of Morocco. They began invading, eventually captured Ghana's capital, Kumbisale, and eventually Ghana fell to the Soso Kingdom, which was, the Soso is another ethnic group in Africa. They're predominantly Muslim now, but the Soso back then were not Muslim. And eventually they conquered Ghana, and that was generally the end of Ghana. So that brings us to the next empire. And if anyone has any questions now, feel free to ask. If not, I will continue. All right, so we're going to continue on. So now we get to the empire of Mali. Now with Ghana, we don't have as much information. Most of everything we have about Ghana comes from a few manuscripts written by Arab explorers and travelers to the region who came back and wrote down what they saw about Ghana. So we don't have much about Ghana. We have a lot more about Mali. There's a lot more information about Mali and even more, okay, got a chat here, and even more about Songhai, which we'll get to next. But for Mali, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on Mali because we do have a lot more information. First, most of the people who made up Mali, and particularly the ruling class of Mali, were from an ethnic group known as the Mandinka. And the Mandinka, sometimes called Malinke, sometimes called Mandingo, is a branch of the Mandi ethnic group, which is a huge group that covers much of West Africa. Now, according to Mali's oral history, they had the Mandinka broke up into 12 clans or 12 hunter guilds, and these clans used to fight each other, but eventually they got tired of fighting each other and united, and they chose one person to be their Mansa, and Mansa essentially means king. And this was the oral beginnings of the Mali Empire. Now, how did Mali become Muslim? As the story goes, and once again, this is oral history, it's hard to verify these things, but it could very likely be true. Once again, Mali did not become Islam or did not become Muslim through force. No Arab army came in and held a sword to anybody's throat and said convert to Islam or die. Simply put, the Almoravid ambassador, and remember the Almoravids was a Muslim sultanate and based in Morocco and mostly in North Africa. The ambassador came to visit Mali as it was starting to grow, and Mali was going through a drought at the time. The ambassador told the king, the Mansa, to pray to Allah and convert to Islam, and the drought would be relieved. And according to the story, that is exactly what happened. And so the Mansa converted to Islam after the drought ended, after the relief from the drought, and many others followed him along the way. Now, the thing about Mali is that it is famous mostly for two very popular kings. The first one is the man who is considered the founder of the Mali Empire, Sunjata, sometimes pronounced Sundiata, but the correct pronunciation is Sunjata. I wish I had the time to go through Sunjata's story, but it is an absolutely amazing story. It's one of those stories like King Arthur or one of these really fantastic medieval stories that talk about how a crippled boy rose to become this mighty emperor and defeated his worst enemy and forged Mali into this powerful empire, which at its height, by the way, was almost as large as the entire continent of Europe, Western Europe, that is. And also the story of Sunjata was also the inspiration for The Lion King. It's similar, but it's different also. But just know that The Lion King, Disney's Lion King with Mufasa and Simba and all that, that was actually inspired by the story of Sunjata. Sunjata, he eventually fought against the Soso. The Soso, once again, was an empire, that kingdom that defeated Ghana. Sunjata fought against the Soso, defeated them, took over their territory, swallowed up their territory along with the remnants of the Ghana Empire, and began to expand. Now, as you can see from the map, one of the most important cities, well, I'll go back to the map. One of the most important cities in Mali was Timbuktu. Timbuktu, which is at the northern extreme of the Empire of Mali, just before the Sahel starts to become Sahara, before the Sahel becomes desert. Timbuktu was originally founded by Tuareg herdsmen in the 11th century. Tuareg is another ethnic group, mostly Berber ethnic group, originally from Yemen, but now they primarily live in between the Sahara and the Sahel of North Africa. The correct name for Timbuktu is actually Tin, T-I-N, Buktu. Buktu was the name of a woman who lived in the region, and she owned a well, and the well attracted people, and they eventually started calling the area the Well of Buktu, which is Tin Buktu. And that's in the local dialect there called Tamashek, which is a local Berber dialect. But it's easier to say Timbuktu than Tin Buktu, and especially with Arabic, with the noon and the meme and the ba coming together. So Timbuktu became this major trading port for the Empire of Mali. Timbuktu was actually captured by Mansa Musa. That is the second most popular, probably the most popular emperor of Mali, and we'll get to him in a moment. But Timbuktu initially was captured by Mansa Musa, and it became famous for its learning and its commerce and culture. Many people are familiar with Timbuktu as a center of learning, and it certainly was. This is another picture of Timbuktu today. It certainly was a major center of learning, but it's also a major commerce center. As I mentioned earlier, Timbuktu was right there at the end of the Sahel and at the beginning of the Sahara Desert. So it was like the last outpost before travelers or merchants really could stop at a major city and then start that long, dangerous journey across the Sahara deserts. It was a major port, a major entry port into the Sahara Desert. And so that allowed us to become a very popular destination for commerce and for trade. As far as learning is concerned, this was really done by Mansa Musa. We are all familiar with Mansa Musa's famous Hajj. I'm not going to go into his Hajj thing. It's story been done many, many times, so I don't want to really go into it. And there's lots more about the Hajj that people don't realize about the Hajj. Once you get past him throwing gold around all over Egypt, there's a lot more to it that is not so fun. But anyway, on his return from that Hajj, and remember he was an emperor traveling with thousands of soldiers and a huge entourage and slaves and things like that. So as he was coming back from Hajj, he did some conquering. That's what emperors do. He did some conquering along the way, and Timbuktu was one of the cities he conquered. It was a peaceful conquest. He didn't slaughter anybody or anything like that, but he did conquer Timbuktu on his way back from that famous Hajj. In any case, once Timbuktu became part of the Empire of Mali, Mansa Musa began investing heavily in Timbuktu. And he began building masajids, mosques, institutes of learning. The Sankore Institute, which I don't think I have a picture of it here. The Sankore, yes, I do, right here. The Sankore Masjid in Timbuktu started off as just a regular masjid, but with Mansa Musa's investment into it, it became not just a masjid, but also a major center of learning. And it received more investment even after that, but Mansa Musa helped to make Sankore into a major Islamic university, for lack of a better phrase. It became a major Islamic university based in Timbuktu, and it wasn't the only one. Mansa Musa funded young men to go and study Islam, mostly for the Maliki fiqh in places like Morocco and Algeria and places like that. They studied Islam there, came back to Timbuktu, came back to Mali, and began to teach Islam in Timbuktu. And before long, nobody had to go out of Timbuktu to learn. People were coming to Timbuktu to learn. Eventually, when the scholarship became very strong and very widespread. And so Timbuktu, as I mentioned, due to Mansa Musa's investment, due to his desire to see it become a major city, it became a center of commerce, culture, and education. Now, speaking of Mansa Musa himself, I'll briefly go through who he was, just so we are familiar with who he was. He was either the grandson of Sunjata, the founder of the Mali Empire, or a grandson of Sunjata's half-brother. I'm not sure, it's not certain basically whether he was directly related to Sunjata or related by one of his brothers. But nonetheless, he was part of that ruling family, the ruling Kita clan. The Kita clan was the name of the clan that ruled Mali. He was part of that ruling clan over Mali. A few generations, or I'll say a few years before Mansa Musa became the emperor of Mali, one of his predecessors, a man named Ku, and his son named Muhammad ibn Ku. These are two emperors of Mali before Mansa Musa. They commissioned thousands of ships to travel across the Atlantic. Now, the ships never made it back. The first one went out and just as an exploration, maybe for conquest, maybe just see what was out there. The emperor led thousands of ships across the Atlantic. So you can get an idea of how Mali looks right here. So you see it goes into the coast, the coast of Senegal and Gambia, and a little bit of Mauritania, and then it goes off into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, there's no direct, strong evidence that they made it across, but there is some circumstantial evidence that they actually made it across. All the way by that, I mean all the way across to the Americas. There is statements from some of the people who traveled with Christopher Columbus that they saw the mass of ships when they arrived, first in the Bahamas and in other parts of the Caribbean. There's also the statements from some people who saw some of the early European explorers who mistook some of the Native Americans that they saw in the Caribbean as Muslims because of the way they dressed and some of the way they act, and some of the ways that they acted in their demeanor. These European explorers, Christopher Columbus and all, they were very familiar with Islam by this time. They're definitely very familiar with it. And so they saw some of these same practices in the Caribbean, and they noted how similar they were to what they knew of Muslims at that time. So there is some evidence that he may have made it across. Allah knows best if he actually did. But after Ku, the first person, tried to make it across, and he never came back. His son then went off after him, also commissioned a bunch of ships, and he never came back either. But before he left, his name was Muhammad ibn Ku. Before he left to go look for his father, who never came back, he commissioned or he deputized Mansa Musa to run the empire after him. And that's essentially how Mansa Musa rose to the throne as the empire of Mali. And he just stayed in power when they never came back. Mansa Musa ruled for roughly 25 years. And during his period, during the time that he lived, that he ruled Mali, Mali grew to its greatest extent, became very powerful, center of learning, center of culture. But once again, in order for empires to grow, there must be warfare. Empires grow through warfare. I think I showed these pictures. Before I go into that, I want to show some of these documents, manuscripts from Mali. These are some manuscripts that I found online. This is I believe this is a astrological calendar developed in Mali. This here is a manuscript on mathematics. You can see down here in the French written applied mathematics. You can see the chart over here where there are numbers and a graph. This is all done in Timbuktu. You can see numbers here, 1, 9. I don't know what those two are. That's not 6, 8 though. It looks like it. But anyway, the point is that these are manuscripts that are still existing in Mali, perhaps made roughly around 1700s or so, that shows that the scholarship of Mali was very advanced. They were doing advanced mathematics, applied mathematics, and Arabic, and sharing with others. Here is another manuscript. I couldn't tell what it was, but because these documents are so old, and they were written on paper and canvas, canvas that can disintegrate over time, the Mali government is trying to scan them so they don't lose them all just through time. But as you may be well aware of, there has been some recent political instability in Mali, which kind of makes it kind of difficult. And unfortunately, some of the instability is caused by other Muslims who believe that these things are heterodox or un-Islamic or innovation, whatever the excuses may be. And so some of them have actually gone about destroying it. So the people of Timbuktu, the Muslims of Mali, are doing their best to protect it. And this is one last manuscript showing another astrological chart. Just an example of the scholarship that was available in Mali during this period of time, particularly in Timbuktu, as well as Jenne, which was another major city in Mali, which we'll get to in just a moment, inshallah. So after Mansa Musa's death, Mali began to decline. All empires eventually decline over time, and this decline eventually led to the rise of the third empire I wanted to discuss, which is the Songhai Empire. And I'll get to the Songhai in just a moment. But again, if anyone has any questions or comments, you feel free to raise your hand before I launch into the Songhai Empire. Okay. All right, now, the Songhai Empire was larger than both the Empire of Ghana and the Empire of Mali. The Songhai Empire was actually larger than Western Europe, as far as just pure land is concerned. Songhai initially began as a vassal of the Mali Empire. And a vassal is, I hate to use this, but it's basically as the relationship between the United States and Israel, and is in many ways. Israel depends on the United States for its existence, and anyone who attacks Israel eventually runs afoul of the United States. So you can see. So Songhai began as a vassal of the Mali Empire. So it was essentially basically independent in a way, but with limited independence and dependence on the Empire of Mali. However, after Mansa Musa's death, as Mali began to decline, Songhai began to fight for its full independence from Mali. Eventually, as Mali got weaker and weaker, Songhai was able to completely throw Mali off, and once it threw Mali off, Songhai began to expand on its own and eventually became an empire in and of itself. Now, the main person who was considered, I guess, the founder of the Songhai Empire was a man named Sunni Ali. Now, Sunni Ali was very different from the other two leaders we mentioned so far. We mentioned Sunjata, we mentioned Mansa Musa. Those are two main we mentioned. Sunjata who was a founder of the Mali Empire. He was what we would consider a nominal Muslim. Muslim, essentially a name only. But he was actually, even though he was only a nominal Muslim, he was still a fairly good ruler. He was a decent ruler, even though he was a strict practitioner of Islam, he was a decent ruler, a just ruler, so forth and so on. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim, and he was also a just ruler as well. This guy, Sunni Ali, the founder of the Songhai Empire, was not a devout Muslim, and he was really a very cruel ruler. He was effective as far as expanding the borders and forging the decaying Mali Empire and taking this territory and making it his own. He was effective. He was an effective conqueror. He was an effective king as far as expanding the borders of the Songhai Empire. But as far as justice was concerned, he was pretty cruel. And we're going to get into some of that in just a moment. Sunni Ali was born around 1440. Give you some aspect of that. Mansa Musa made his Hajj in 1324. So we're talking about a little bit over 120 years after Mansa Musa's Hajj was when Sunni Ali was born. So he was born in 1440. Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492. So you see that this is roughly 50 years or so before Christopher Columbus crossed over the Atlantic. Just try and keep things in perspective so you can understand when these things are happening. In any case, so Sunni Ali was born. His father was Muslim. His mother was most likely a practitioner of traditional African religions. And yes, before I go into the Songhai, I do want to double back real quick to Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire. Again, with the slavery issue, Mali was an empire, and Mali did expand. And Mali expanded at the expense of other people. It conquered other people, and those who resisted them were often captured, and many of them were enslaved. Now, Mali, like much of West Africa, did not have gigantic plantations. They didn't have any use for large-scale labor. And so most of these captured people became commodities, basically, and were shipped mostly to Timbuktu and then across the Atlantic into North Africa, and then from there, sometimes into Europe and other parts of the world as well. Now, again, their perspective of slavery was different from ours. The slave trade, no matter how you cut it, is always brutal. So no matter who does it, whether it's Muslims do it, Europeans, Christians do it, doesn't matter. The slave trade is usually brutal. There's no way to transport millions of people across a desert or across an ocean without there being some brutality involved. So I don't want to minimize that part. However, the treatment of slaves amongst Muslims was considerably better than the treatment of slaves we're familiar with, particularly in much of the Western Christian world. Even though the slave trade itself was brutal, the treatment of slaves was much, much better amongst the Muslim world. For one thing, in Islam, you can't enslave your children. That's the thing. And in the American Christian world that we're familiar with, you can enslave your children. So you have several examples of even founding fathers who had children who were slaves and enslaved their own children, sometimes sold their own children. That is inconceivable in Islam. So yes, in Islam, we do have the idea of concubinage and concubines, and whether it's morally right or not is something different. But the fact is that if someone does have a child through a concubine or through a slave, they can't enslave their own child. And so that child will be born free, and so the slavery ends at that generation. And there are many examples across the Muslim world of people who had slave mothers but wound up becoming emperors, sultans, sometimes even caliphs, kings, generals. So it was very, even though, like I said, I don't want to minimize the aspect of slavery in the Muslim world. And yes, there were millions of Muslims, I'm sorry, millions of Africans who were enslaved by Muslims. Many of them, however, were enslaved by African Muslims, not necessarily Arab Muslims coming across and capturing. That did happen, but it wasn't so much Africans as it was really more African Muslims expanding their empire and taking their captives and selling the captives into slavery. I don't want to minimize it once again, but I want to make sure that it's clear, and we'll talk about a little bit more after we talk about Songhai. I want to make it clear that while it did happen and it was very expansive, it wasn't as brutal as the Western counterpart of it. We'll get back to that later on, inshallah. So let's go back to Songhai, as I mentioned. So Sunni Ali, he began the expansion of the Songhai Empire, mostly by taking up the parts of the Mali Empire that broke off and that were no longer, that Mali was no longer able to hold on to as it disintegrated. One of these places that Sunni Ali conquered was Timbuktu. Initially, as Mali weakened, the Tuaregs, as we mentioned, that was that Berber group we mentioned earlier, the Tuaregs captured and occupied Timbuktu. The scholars of Timbuktu, at this point in time, Timbuktu was a well-known center of learning and culture and economy. The scholars of Timbuktu reached out to Sunni Ali and asked him for help in expelling the Berber invaders of Timbuktu. Sunni Ali came with his army, and they did expel the Berbers, the Tuaregs, from Timbuktu, but then they turned on Timbuktu and began ransacking, pillaging, and sacking Timbuktu. They did more damage to Timbuktu as their supposed saviors than the Berbers had. Sunni Ali's army massacred hundreds, if not thousands, of Islamic scholars in Timbuktu. There are many reasons why Sunni Ali, who was nominally Muslim also, there are many explanations for why he had such hatred for the scholars of Timbuktu. There is stories that they had slighted him, or that they had ridiculed him for his poor pronunciation of Arabic, for his poor knowledge of Islam, and he wanted to show them a lesson or make a lesson of them or whatever. Who knows? The fact of the matter is, Sunni Ali captured Timbuktu and pillaged and nearly destroyed the entire city and killed thousands of African Islamic scholars in the city. Now, Sunni Ali's destruction of Timbuktu, we didn't really destroy it, but his desecration and sacking of Timbuktu kind of made him a pariah. So he lost the connections to the North African Muslim states of the Berber and Arab North African Muslim states, and they refused to have too much to do with him because of how he treated the Muslims of Timbuktu. But he didn't care. He kept on conquering. He went on and conquered, and eventually he conquered Jinneh. And Jinneh, you can see right there. Hopefully you can see my mouse right here. Jinneh was another major city within the Mali Empire. For whatever reason, Sunni Ali treated Jinneh completely different from the way he treated Timbuktu. Yes, he conquered Jinneh as well, but he didn't sack it. He didn't destroy it. He actually invested in Jinneh the same way as Mansa Musa had invested in Timbuktu. So he actually turned Jinneh into a center of scholarship, not almost a rival to what Timbuktu was. And Jinneh became a major center of scholarship. I thought I had some mosques. Yeah, this is one of the major mosques in Jinneh, in what is now the Republic of Mali. You can see another picture here. This is a huge mud brick mosque. Mud mosque, I think it's the largest one in the world. And the little spoke sticking out is for water to run off, because obviously water and mud don't mix. So this is this shows you that Sunni Ali was very active, even though he was a bit of a maniac and he killed lots of Muslims. He was still interested and vital in the buildup of Jinneh as an independent city. Now, eventually, however, Sunni Ali died, and his son took over. Sunni Ali, I believe, was actually assassinated by his own soldiers, but neither here nor there. His son took over. but his son was overthrown by the last and final major leader we'll talk about, a man named Askia Muhammad. Now, the word Askia actually means a military commander or a general. So his name was actually Muhammad Tore, but he is known to history as Askia Muhammad. So while Sunni Ali was this maniacal, crazy, bloodthirsty king who didn't really practice Islam, Askia Muhammad was more or less in line with Mansa Musa. Now, he didn't have the money that Mansa Musa had. He didn't have the tons of excess gold that Mansa Musa had, but his piety and his knowledge or his ability or his perception, I should say, as a pious Muslim and his conquests were on the level of Mansa Musa. And so Askia Muhammad, he was able to restore Songhai to good standings after Sunni Ali had done so much to damage Songhai's reputation. In fact, Askia Muhammad may have started off as a slave. He was definitely a prisoner. It's not certain if he was a slave or not, but he was definitely a prisoner of war within the Songhai, by the Songhai. He then joined the military, and this is what many Muslim empires did. The Ottomans did it, the Mamluks did it, the Mughals did it. Very often they would take slaves and turn them into soldiers. And those slaves who survived the battles could often rise up to become very powerful. Askia Muhammad is an example of that. He was initially a captive, most likely a slave. He was forced into the military, or maybe he joined it voluntarily, but I'm pretty sure he was forced into it. And before long, he rose to become an Askia, a general. His military capabilities shone through. He became a general, and eventually he overthrew Sunni Bado, who was the son of Sunni Ali, and Askia Muhammad established himself as the emperor of Songhai. Just another example of how being a slave in the Muslim world is not necessarily a dead end. We can see how Askia Muhammad rose up to become the emperor of the largest empire in West Africa ever. It still is, except for the French, if you count them, but I don't really count them. But this is he became the emperor of the largest African empire largest empire in West Africa. Askia Muhammad, as he became the emperor, he began to reinvest in Timbuktu. He helped to revitalize Timbuktu and bring it back to the status that it had after Sunni Ali had destroyed it and killed so many people there. He also invested in Sankore University and Sankore Masjid. That's this one right here. So that helped Sankore become a major investment. See, my throat's getting dry. He helped Sankore become a major center of learning, and he invested in Janneh as well. He didn't neglect it either. And so between Janneh and Timbuktu, Songhai grew and grew, and eventually grew all the way over to occupy all the way to the west, as we can see here, going into Senegal and Gambia, and even to the north on into Mali and a bit into Mauritania and Morocco will be up there. Askia Muhammad also ventured east. You see here all the way into this part of Niger, and this is, I believe, Niger over here. This conflicts with Hausa territory. The Hausa is another predominantly Muslim ethnic group, primarily based in Niger and Nigeria, areas like that, though they're spread out throughout many other parts of Africa. They're all Muslim for the most part, but Askia Muhammad did have, it's not certain of whether he actually fought against them or if he just had disputes and clashes with them, but he did conquer some of their territory as well. And ultimately, the Songhai Empire, as mentioned, grew to be even larger than much of West Africa. All right, so Askia Muhammad died in 1538. All right, so remember, Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492. Askia Muhammad died in 1538. Around this time, after Askia Muhammad died, I see my time is coming close. I'm going to try to wrap things up real quick. After Askia Muhammad died, the Songhai Empire began to go into decline. One of the major factors of that decline was an invasion from a Moroccan sultan. For centuries actually, these West African empires didn't really have to worry about any invasions from the north, either from the Arabs or the Berbers or any of that. They didn't have to worry about that because of the Sahara Desert. And so for anyone to come into this area, they would have to get across that Sahara Desert, and it is nearly impossible to get a large military force across the Sahara Desert. You have to feed those soldiers, you have to feed their horses or the camels, you have to ship all this water and food, you have to not only the soldiers, they have your attendants, you have all the what they call camp followers. It's a lot of work. And so the West African empires were pretty much safe because of the natural border of the Sahara Desert. But the Moroccans were able to acquire an early type of gun called the arquebus. That's this right here, early type of gun called the arquebus. It's really a musket. It's a very early musket. It's not much more than a small cannon on a stick. Very low accuracy, but when fired in volleys, they can be very effective. Because they were able to use these guns, they didn't have to have a very large force to go across the Sahara. The Moroccan Sultan, when he decided to conquer Songhai, he was able to send a much smaller force, only 4,000, because they had a technological advantage over the Songhai warriors. And so even though basically, I'm getting a little bit too far ahead. Because they had a small force, the Moroccans were able to cross the Sahara much easier and without bringing as much material and food and water with them. They were able to cross the Sahara, and even though they were vastly outnumbered by the Songhai military, that technological advantage allowed them to defeat Songhai several times. Now, it wasn't just one big battle. There were many, many battles, but the Moroccans were able to eventually start making major inroads into the Songhai Empire and started capturing large portions of the Songhai Empire. This couldn't last for very long. The Moroccans, this by the way happened in 1591, so now it's roughly 100 years after Columbus crossed the ocean. So eventually the Moroccans had to call the war off. The Moroccan sultans or the Moroccan sultans who were funding this war, they had to call the war off because it was just too expensive to continuously fund this war all the way across the Sahara Desert. So they eventually called it off. However, many of the Moroccan soldiers stayed in Songhai, and they married local women, and they became what we would now call warlords. They were small little princes or whatever, or ruled these small little territories with their own little group of warriors, and they had their own little tiny regions that were theirs, and they constantly fought against each other. These different Moroccan warlords, who after a while became pretty much African because they married into the local African community. But these descendants of these Moroccan warlords were constantly fighting, just like you see warlords today in many parts of the world, or how it used to be in Afghanistan before more recent events. But the point is that these warlords began fighting against each other, and this devastated Songhai and really devastated West Africa. As these warlords continue to fight against each other, and when people fight, as I mentioned before, when there's fighting between individuals, that leads to captives, and captives have either three options: ransom, execution, or slavery. Those are usually the three options for captives. At this point in time, as I mentioned, we are now 100 years after Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The Europeans realized that Columbus was completely wrong. He did not discover a new way to Asia. He had discovered a completely new continent that they had never known about before. The Europeans were steadily growing their colonies in this new part of the world, particularly in the Caribbean and in Brazil. They needed people to work these new plantations that they were building in these new colonies. And with all of this fighting going on in the former Songhai Empire, there was an influx of slaves and captives ready-made for different warlords to sell their enemies off to different people. Now, they most likely didn't know that they were going to go across the Middle Passage and all the horrors of the Middle Passage that we know about before. And this is not the only way that slaves got into America. I'm not saying, I want you to be clear. There are many ways that the slave trade happened, the transatlantic slave trade happened, but this was a major contribution to it. And this warfare between the Iman, got a question. It's time for me to wrap up.
No,
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. So I wanted to ask a quick question if I could.
Sure.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This is I guess it was probably a challenge for you to try to drill down so much information into this presentation. But just with regard to the Europeans' encroachment into Africa, and then the ongoing um, conflicts that were going on, with between empires and African tribes and such. Um, was there a point that they began to recognize um, their I guess their weakness in terms of the I guess the unified force that was benefiting from their conflict? Was there ever a moment where the exploration went outside of where they were familiar with the Europeans at all?
Well, yes, the Africans were definitely familiar with Europeans. You mean before slavery, before the
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, before all the infighting happened, yes, they were definitely familiar with the Europeans. Africans did travel to um to North Africa. Well, I'll say Black Africans traveled to North Africa, and they did intermingle and intermix and meet with Europeans who interacted with there from there. And some of them also joined as mercenaries. So there is definitely some interaction there. There's also when Mansa Musa made his Hajj, he met with many other Muslim dignitaries, including representatives from the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire were controlled a huge chunk of Europe as well. And so, yeah, they definitely had interaction with the other Europeans, with Europeans in general. Afterwards, once after the trans-Saharan slave trade started between Africa and the Americas, it took a while for Africans to really realize what was going on. And there were many examples, and even some of Muslims who tried to convince the Europeans to trade something else besides people. Let's trade something else besides our own people, or even our enemies' people, when they realized what was happening. But the Europeans used various tricks to keep the Africans, to either force them to do it. So, for instance, if an African king or whatever, he's at war with another African king, but he doesn't want to sell his captives to the Europeans, to the French or the English or the Dutch, or whatever, to ship across to America. If he complained about it, then the European will just say, okay, well, we'll sell the weapons to this other guy and he'll use it to conquer you. And so they found many ways around it. So they knew about them. And even before that, before the slave trade, they knew about the Europeans, and there's some interaction with them. I'm trying to think of a good example. They're definitely, well, here's one example, for instance. In the 1400s, the Portuguese wanted to trade with India, where all the spices were. But the Ottoman Empire, who were Muslim, they controlled the land routes into Asia, between Europe and Asia, through where Istanbul is located right now. And so going through Ottoman territory was dangerous and or expensive. And so the Portuguese were trying to find a way around Africa to get to India. They eventually found it, but it took them many, many years. But before they actually found their way around Africa, they would stop along the West African coast and often tried to invade the African coast and capture Africans living on the coast as slaves. But this proved to be fruitless because in the 1400s, the Muslim African empires were very strong. And they easily defeated any Portuguese landing party and drove them off. And so the Portuguese quickly learned that they couldn't invade Africa, at least in the 1400s. In the 1400s, now 100 years later, really 200 years later, it became much easier. But in the 1400s, they couldn't. And so there was definitely interaction between them. And in fact, the Portuguese found it easier to just buy slaves from the West African kingdoms rather than try to kidnap them. So that did happen. So there was interaction between them. As far as Africans going into Europe, I'm certain it happened. I have to, as a matter of fact, I know of stories. I've read stories of Africans going into Europe from these West African countries. Some of them either stayed there, some of them converted to Christianity, or their children converted to Christianity because they were disconnected from their Muslim homeland, or they may have been animist or not. They may have practiced traditional African religions, and they stayed there and they just mixed in. And particularly in Portugal, this happened. I know of stories where this has happened, but I don't have the full details of it. But yeah, there were definitely Africans who went into Europe. Now, were the major explorers, like we have Ibn Battuta, who was Arab or Berber, I believe. I don't know of any, but if I do my research, I could probably find them, but I have to look into it. But I hope I answered your question, ma'am. If not, let me know if I missed anything.
No, you did. Thank you very much.
All right, no problem. Alhamdulillah.
And I know we have about 2 minutes left. I
Okay.
wonder if there's any other questions or comments from the believers. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you do have those.
If I could ask a quick follow-up, if nobody else has a question.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier about Timbuktu and how differing opinions on some of that classical scholarship and literature that has been preserved. And I remember seeing this in the news some years back, how I think some of the monuments and buildings and things had been, destroyed. Um, uh, do you know what's the state of that today?
As far as I know, the group, I mean, it's hard sometimes to trust our media, so I can't always
Yeah.
I can always trust what we hear on the news. But from what I understand, I believe Boko Haram or whatever group that splintered off from it is the government of Mali is still fighting against them along with I believe the French, though the French are kind of backing off now. So they're not as much of a threat as they used to be. There's still some conflict going on as far as I'm aware, but I'm almost certain they've been driven out of Timbuktu and they no longer have access to Timbuktu, but there's still holdouts from what I understand. I haven't really looked into it in several months, so I don't know the current status. But last I've heard, between the French government and the Mali government, they were able to restore much control, and Timbuktu, I believe, is as of now within the hands of the Mali government, I believe.
All right, the very last thing, because I know we're at time. Is there a reputable what reputable news services or outlets would you recommend in terms of just keeping up with in terms of information regarding the African continent? I know that's larger than what you were speaking, but just,
Yeah. Probably, if I had to guess, maybe Al Jazeera might be. It's not the best one, but Al Jazeera often shows things that Western nations don't show. I can't think of too many other English languages. I had to look into. There's also I forgot the name of it. There's a Turkish one as well. Turkey has an English language news outlet. It's I can't remember the name of it, but there's one from Turkey, and between Turkey and Al Jazeera, those are probably some of the better ones that are probably more reliable than I would say. At least you can combine what you hear from them with information you get from the Western news sources. But things like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, even the BBC, which is actually better than the others, I don't trust those guys. But I'll say just Al Jazeera and perhaps once I remember the Turkish one, I'll mention. I just can't remember the name right now.
Okay. Well, thank you. Jazakallah.
And thank you, Imam Tariq, for your questions. You've given us a lot of great information, and we thank you abundantly. Can you tell us one more time where we can find your podcast so that we can continue to learn with you?
Best thing would be Islamic History Podcast. Let me bring it up here. It's also on YouTube, and that's not the one I want. Let me bring up my other one. But yeah, YouTube basically, or any podcast platform. Nothing is working for me today. All right. Anyway, YouTube or any podcast platform, you can see the Islamic History Podcast. Currently, I'm talking about the Arab Revolt of World War I. But yeah, Islamic History Podcast.
I've also, yes, I wrote it in the chat as well.
Yeah, there it goes.
Do you have believers giving you gratitude. Thank you so much for this information-rich presentation. This is a history that we don't often hear. I came upon your Islamic history podcast this past Ramadan and have been listening ever since. Another comment, a most excellent presentation. I pray there is a follow-up. And so please feel free, dear believers, to unmute yourself and give our gratitude to our dear Imam Muttaqi for all of the great information he's given us today. Inshallah, you continue to do the work that you're doing that is a blessing to our community.
I mean, Hamdulillah, thank you. And I'll be happy to continue follow up. We'll go into other topics, inshallah, whenever you guys want to invite me, I'll be happy to join, inshallah.
We'll definitely take you on that, inshallah.
Yes, thank you so much. That was excellent presentation.
Very
Walaikum
informative. Thank you.
You're welcome, sisters. Thank you, alhamdulillah. You're welcome.
Thank you, man. You're
Thank
doing
you
such
so
a
much.
job.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. All right, thank you, brother, man.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, that was really, really great.
Alhamdulillah, thank you, sir. Alhamdulillah.
All right, dear believers, you all have a beautiful week, and thank you again.
All right.